Hello everyone, Sam here, and we gotta talk about Some Words with a Mummy by Edgar Allan Poe. Uh, Obviously, it's not this full book. This is just a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's complete tales. It says complete poems, but I know there's some poems that are not in this, so. But I'm pretty sure it is his complete tales, so that part's not false advertising. Uh, but like I said, Some Words with a Mummy. Uh, this was written by Edgar Allan Poe, and it was published in April of 1845 in a magazine called The American Review, a Whig journal of politics, literature, art, and science. And that's Whig with WHIG, because it was the American political party called the Whig Party. He was a predecessor to the Republican Party. And that becomes a very interesting detail a little later on, as I'll show. And this is the first episode this month of Mummy May, which I announced in a previous video that I was going to spend a good chunk of May talking about mummies. Unfortunately, I got started much later than I'd hoped. I've only really started within the last few days, when almost half the month has gone by, and I'm going to be traveling for about a week coming up, so going to be doing a lot of cramming for Mummy May, but better late than never, and this is going to be the first Mummy May story that I'll be looking at. This is also going to be the very first episode. If you looked at the title, you probably noticed. This will be the first episode of The Shadow of Poe. And The Shadow of Poe is what I am calling my review series that focuses on Edgar Allan Poe stories and looking at their influence. Because one of the things that's always kind of annoyed me with many literary studies is that many people acknowledge Edgar Allan Poe's influence on American and world literature, but they tend to just sort of think of him as a horror writer, because whenever you think of Edgar Allan Poe, you think of his horror stuff. I mean, on this collection of his, what you have here is, it's hard to see on this, but it's The Raven from his Raven poem. And when you ask most people what they first think of when they think of Poe, they're going to think of like The Telltale Heart or The Cask of Amontillado, his horror works. But I'm doing The Shadow of Poe to show that he was actually much more influential of an author in different genres and was just a multi-genre writer in general. And this story, Some Words of a Mummy, is a good example of that, as I'll show in a little bit. But to talk about Some Words with a Mummy as a story, this was one of Poe's later stories, as it was published in 1845, just around 4 years before his death. So this was not newbie Poe of the early 1830s. This was Poe already as a strong, experienced author. So that's an interesting element to this story. And according to the sources I looked up, this story was significant for being one of the earliest stories dealing with a living mummy. It was not the first. That was something that was not, that Poe cannot claim to be the first author to do. Apparently, there were other living mummy writers, though supposedly he was one of the first. He was one of the earliest to do it. So he can't take the title as the first guy to do a living mummy story, but he can claim to be one of the earliest. Though, interestingly, his story was the first one to feature an illustrated depiction of a revived mummy. Admittedly, I got this from Wikipedia, so I don't know how true it is, but when there was a UK publishing company that did a reprint of this story in 1852, 3 years after Poe had died, and it actually illustrated this story, showing the moment where the mummy is revived. And supposedly that is the very first illustrated depiction of a living mummy or a revived mummy. It's the picture you see as the thumbnail to this video. I decided I would just include it for that interesting distinction. And what's interesting about Some Words of a Mummy is that despite what the title implies, and the fact that Poe was much more renowned for a horror writer, this story actually is not a horror story. It's actually a humorous satire, which Poe had actually done a number of. He wrote satires pretty much throughout his whole writing career, and sometimes it was for legitimately artistic reasons. Poe was an editor and a cultural commentator, and he frequently used his satires to make fun of things he saw in society. But other times he did it for financial reasons, because he needed to put food on the table, and sometimes political magazines or whatever the local journals would take satire more easily than they take horror. So he kind of had a mixture of reasons for doing satire, but by the time he wrote this, he was an experienced satirist. And it's actually very similar to an earlier satire Poe did called A Decided Loss. A Decided Loss was about, also dealt with this idea of revivification via electricity and the living dead, and which is something that Some Words of a Mummy also deal with. A Decided Loss was later re-edited and re-released as a story called Loss of Breath, which was actually released after Some Words with a Mummy, but it's basically just a re-edited version of A Decided Loss. So A Decided Loss has a lot of similar vibes to Some Words with a Mummy. As you can see, I read this story from my Edgar Allan Poe collection. I got this a little over a decade ago, and I actually bought it for a penny. Whoever had this really wanted to get rid of it and sold it to me for a penny. Admittedly, that doesn't include shipping. The shipping was like $5, so it was not truly a penny, but I can say I bought it for a penny, and that's technically true. But yeah, so I've had this for a while, and this is going to pretty much be my resource when I talk about any of the Shadow of Poe episodes going forward. So this was an easy story to read because I've had this for several years. But what is the actual plot of Some Words with a Mummy? Well, the plot is essentially this unnamed narrator who has gone to sleep after a big meal. This is an important detail, you'll soon learn. He goes to bed after a big meal, but he's woken up in the middle of the night because a professor acquaintance of his has just gotten the permission to unwrap a mummy from the local museum in New York City. And so the narrator and a bunch of other people go to this unwrapping event, and they unwrap the mummy, and they're actually surprised to learn that the mummy doesn't look like any other mummy they've unwrapped before, because it doesn't show the telltale signs of dissection that many mummies had. So that's kind of a strange thing. And they also learned that the mummy's name is Allamistakeo. Say that really slow and you'll see the joke in that name. And speaking of jokes, the gathered men decided, just on a lark, they say, hey, why don't we see what happens when we electrocute this mummy? Like, they're not really doing it out of scientific brilliance or like any way to push science forward. They're just kind of doing it for laughs. And they do, but the problem is they actually revive him, because it turns out the mummy was in suspended animation. He wasn't actually dead. And they are initially quite excited, because this means they can learn about ancient Egypt from this person who was there, because this mummy, Allamistakeo, was there thousands of years ago. So they're initially quite excited. But this is where the main comedic conceit of the story takes place, which is where they soon start to regret reviving him, because they start to learn ancient Egypt might have actually been a more put-together society than modern-day America. Modern-day 1845 America, keep that in mind. And they, instead of being excited, they soon start to get like aggressive and get into this debate with Allamistakeo over whether ancient Egypt or 1845 America is the more advanced civilization. And that's the core conceit of the piece, just examining which one of our societies was better. So shenanigans ensue, and that's the central concept of the story. So to talk about what does and doesn't work about the story, I guess I'll start off with what doesn't work for me. And what the big thing that didn't work for me was the punchline of the story, or I should say one of the punchlines, because there's two punchlines to this story. One was the final conclusion: the scientists and Allamistakeo come to at the end of the story, and the second one is what the narrator decides to do at the end of the story. What the narrator decides to do, that's a pretty decent punchline. That works pretty well. But it's the first one that occurs with the scientists and Allamistakeo that doesn't quite work. And essentially, I'm trying not to spoil too much, but Allamistakeo comes to a certain conclusion because he learns about modern day medicine, and the medicine that makes him change, or that makes him think about modern day America, is something called Brandreth's pills. And this is treated as like the big punchline to the story. But as someone who was not around in 1845, I had no clue what Brandreth's pills were. And I looked it up online. Apparently, they were liver pills. They were pills that were supposed to help with your liver. And some sources I found said they were kind of like a laxative Uh, so the gag is that the final conclusion everybody comes to about whether ancient Egypt is better or modern America is better comes down to a contemporary reference to Brandreth's pills. And if you have no clue what Brandreth's pills are, you're not really going to get that joke. And that was kind of a common problem with a lot of Edgar Allan Poe's satires, because since Poe was commenting on the elements of the day, the events of his time, there were a lot of contemporary references or references to past material that were popular at the time, but which we don't really know much about today. So that's kind of the problem with a satire, because satires kind of lend themselves to becoming more dated, because if you don't know what a thing is being referenced to in these stories, and it's a contemporary reference, if that reference doesn't travel to the modern day, especially when you're in a story from 1845, that's gonna kind of make things difficult. So yeah, that punchline doesn't quite work unless you have an idea of what Brandreth's pills are. So there's the second biggest problem I had was that the story was kind of inconsistent about Allamistakeo's knowledge. And I don't necessarily mean with ancient Egypt, but in how he knows about contemporary things. Because when he wakes up, he automatically knows everybody's name in the room. And it's kind of like, well, wait, how did he know that? Was he like listening while he was in suspended animation or something? And then there's moments where the gathered men tell him about all the modern achievements of 1845 America, and there are some points where he doesn't know about the achievements of America, and people have to describe it to him. But other times it's written as if, no, he already knows about him, and he's not impressed by him. And it's kind of like, it's very inconsistent about what he does know and what he doesn't know. And that to me kind of ruined some of the comedic elements of the story, because of the implication was, yeah, he already knew all this stuff beforehand, because, you know, it was cyclical or something, like the Egyptians are so advanced they can track the rise and fall of a civilization just through general guesswork. That would be kind of funny. But the story sort of implies that at one point, but a lot of times it just kind of comes off, he knows and doesn't know things based on what would be funny in that moment. And comedy with comedic satires, inconsistencies can be permissible, but here I think it actually does harm the comedic elements of the story somewhat, because if he's inconsistent, that kind of means Egyptian society is inconsistent, and that's not the point of the story. So that element was kind of making the story a little wobbly for me. And now I want to talk about the stuff that does work here. And there's actually a surprising large amount that works here. One thing Poe kind of tackles in this story is kind of that idea of simultaneously hating the present but also kind of defending it out of sheer stubbornness. Because one of the big themes of the story is that the narrator kind of hates his life. He's busy. He's always tired. He never gets a rest because he's always running around. His wife is always nagging him. So the ending of the story essentially implies that he's going to become a mummy himself to get away from this annoying present that he's stuck in. And but Poe also kind of acknowledges that there is sort of this defense of the modern era, because all the men, including the narrator, who otherwise hates his present life, they all sort of defend the modern day America because mostly because they're just too stubborn to admit that, maybe the ancient Egyptians really did have a better grasp of civilization and technology than we did. And they're kind of just sort of fighting Allamistakeo out of sheer stubborn pride, because they refuse to admit that the modern day is filled with a bunch of problems that the Egyptians had really solved long ago. So that's kind of an interesting element of that strange hatred of the present, but also the desire to insist, no, things are better, just because you don't want to admit that somebody in the past maybe had it right and you have it wrong. So that's kind of an interesting element here. There's also Edgar Allan Poe is not someone you associate with comedy, but there's actually a lot of good physical comedy in this story. Probably the highlights are the narrator who opens the story eating excessively more and more cheese. That's kind of a weird opening scene, but it's a funny scene. You have Allamistakeo being shocked awake, and they place the shockers on his body on like really weird positions, like his nose or his big toe, like just really weird places to shock a guy. And of course he wakes up angry because they shocked him on his big toe. And there's also this funny scene where they decide, all right, we got to make Allamistakeo dress like a modern man, and they just keep shoving like every single article of clothing you can on a person, to the point of ridiculousness, and he's pretty much just a bundle of clothes by the time they're done with him. So there's some good physical comedy here. And one thing I noticed that was kind of amusing is that, like I said, this is a late era Poe story. And the funny thing is that the story kind of feels like Poe poking fun at himself in a lot of times, or at least poking fun at a lot of his tropes, because probably the biggest thing I noticed was the unreliable narrator. If you know anything about Poe, you know that he really liked unreliable narrators, these crazed men who are telling of their crimes, and you're always kind of wondering how much of what they're saying is true. Probably the most famous example was The Telltale Heart, where the main guy is crazy, but he insists that no, he had to kill this old man because of his evil eye. And this story has an unreliable narrator, but it's not because he's crazy. It's because he's flat out drunk. That opening scene I tell you where he eats a lot of cheese, he also drinks a lot of dark stout, which is a beer. And he is absolutely plastered when this stuff with the mummy comes. And there's also a thing about how he's also an unreliable narrator because he lies about how much cheese he eats. It in the story it's called Welsh rabbit. That was the name for this cheese dish. But he lies about how much cheese he eats. He's not lying about a murder, he's lying about cheese. So that feels like kind of a weird thing where Edgar Allan Poe is sort of riffing on his unreliable narrator character. But instead of the character being unreliable because they're trying to, like, play down their crimes, this guy's unreliable because he's a glutton and who doesn't want to admit that he's eating too much, and he's also flat out drunk. So that's kind of an interesting riff on Poe's tropes. There's also kind of this interesting... He also plays on the Poe trope of, like, being buried. Because if you've read Poe, you know that he had a very deep obsession with being buried alive. He had stories like The Black Cat, The Cask of Amontillado, The Premature Burial, especially. But again, in this story, it's kind of played for laughs because in the end, the narrator decides, maybe I would like to be buried as a mummy so that I can get away from all this nonsense. So it's kind of a thing of, instead of being buried alive, being seen as this terrifying outcome, it's actually seen as kind of like, oh yeah, this will get me away from all the craziness of modernity. So, yeah, it really does feel like Poe sort of taking his tropes and putting a comedic spin on them, which is really interesting to see. See him do that kind of tactic. I don't know how intentional it was, because Poe was usually fairly serious, even in his comedies. He was trying to make serious points in his comedic satires, but I don't know, maybe he was sort of thinking about his previously done tropes and trying to do these little comedic twists on them. And in fact, another thing I really liked about this story is that Poe seems to sort of be reflecting on how situations that would normally be horror scenarios can become comedic simply by the circumstances they happen in. Because a revived mummy, as anybody who's seen any movie within the last 100 years can tell you, a mummy coming to life is often used as a horror trope. But here, the revived mummy doesn't spark horror, instead sparks annoyance and debate, because many of the individuals in the area who are meeting this mummy are either drunk or they woke up late at night and are kind of crabby. So again, it's kind of an interesting thing of Poe writing this and sort of thinking that a horror scenario might come from this, but instead a goofy satire happens. So that's kind of interesting. It's actually very similar to this other Poe story that was a very early Poe story called Bon Bon. And the chief idea of that story is that the devil shows up to this cook's house and sits down to have a discussion with him and debate the intricacies of life and people's souls. And it seems like it's a horror scenario because the devil is described in a very horrific manner. His design would absolutely work in a horror story, but the execution of the story is just the devil realizing how Sir Bon Bon, who is debating him, is kind of a not very bright. So it's a horror scenario that twists itself into a comedic scenario just because of the strange characters that happen to be in the story. So this was a concept that Poe seemed to return to a lot. The idea of the the horror scenario that becomes comedic simply because of the character's zaniness. There's also one section in here I really want to read because it's the reason why they decide to revive the mummy. It's a funny passage. Okay, here it is. It's on page 469 in my version. Quote, "The application of electricity to a mummy 3,000 or 4,000 years old at the least was an idea, if not very sage, still sufficiently original, and we all caught it at once. About 1/10 in earnest and 9/10 in jest, we arranged a battery in the doctor's study and conveyed hither the Egyptian." So it's only 2 sentences, but I find it really funny because they say, this idea is, the idea of shocking a mummy of electricity is not wise, but it's original. And what's funny about that is that I think Poe is clearly being sarcastic with that line, considering the fact that, Frankenstein had come out over 20 years earlier, which I'm sure Poe was quite aware of. So, them saying it's sufficiently original, that kind of feels like a bit of a joke on Poe's part. And I like the thing about how it was 1/10 in earnest and 9/10 in jest, meaning they did it mostly as a joke rather than any serious scientific reason. So again, kind of that thing of, a horror scenario becomes comedic because the characters treat it comedically. So that's kind of amusing. The other thing about it, and I discovered this by reading some sources about this, both on Wikipedia and some other Poe scholars, but this story is sort of satirizing the whole Egyptology and Egyptomania that was sort of running around at the time. Like I said in Mummy May, my main Mummy May video, this was... there's this conception that the fascination with Egypt only started happening in the 1920s when King Tut's tomb was uncovered. But it really hasn't. It's been a centuries-long fascination by many Western nations. And with Poe's case, the reason the Egyptomania came about, according to the scholars I found, was that the Rosetta Stone, the famous tablet that shows ancient Egyptian along with ancient Greek, that helped to translate a lot of the old Egyptian hieroglyphics, that was discovered in 1799, over 40 years before this story was written. And that was what really kicked off the Egyptomania and people getting interested in Egyptian studies. But this story kind of satirizes that mania towards Egypt, and especially ancient Egypt, kind of showing how that the obsession with it might cause discontentment, especially if you resurrect an ancient Egyptian and learn that, oh yeah, the ancient Egyptians, they had it much better than you guys. You guys here in the modern America who are doing silly things that we, the ancient Egyptians, figured out long ago. So it's kind of saying you might not want to obsess with Egypt because you might learn that they had it much better than you did. So that's kind of an interesting take on the Egyptian fascination. And I wrote this note down because I kind of noticed this reading some of these stories, and especially this story. One of the big themes in a lot of these mummy stories is like this romanticization of ancient Egypt, and just sort of portraying it as like, wow, this great place, this place worth obsessing over, this great civilization. And this story kind of critiques that, because like I said, it critiques it as saying, well, maybe it was too great of a civilization to the point that it makes our modern day civilization look terrible. And with the ending of the story where the narrator is very heavily considering becoming a mummy himself so he can get out of 1845 and wake up. I think in the story he says he wants to wake up in 2045. Poe is sort of framing this idea of the Egyptian contribution of being a mummy, and sort of framing it as if it's like an attempt to escape and not deal with the problems of the present. Like, just, if you're fed up with the world, just turn yourself into a mummy and you'll wake up in a couple hundred, maybe even a couple thousand years. So that's kind of an interesting concept where Poe is sort of commenting on the fact that this romanticization of Egypt is kind of a way of escaping the problems of today. So that's kind of an interesting element. I also like how there's a little bit of a political satire here, because when the mummy wakes up, they have to speak to it in ancient Egyptian, and some of the scholars there know ancient Egyptian. But interestingly, there's a funny moment where they have to explain to him the concept of politics, because Allamistakeo does not really have a conception of politics, because in his day it was just the pharaoh running things, the pharaoh and his men and his advisors. So the concept of politics is very narrow. He doesn't really understand the general idea, and they have to actually do hieroglyphics of what a politician is. That's very funny. And I also try to explain what the Whig Party is in America. In order to do that, they have to snatch a literal wig off one of the modern day men's heads. So that, and that's doubly funny considering that this was published, as I mentioned earlier, in a Whig Party publication. Out of curiosity, I looked it up to see if this was like meant to be a slight dig by Poe towards the Whigs. It might have been, but some sources I read said it was actually meant to be published in another publication that was not associated with the Whig Party. But for one reason or another, Edgar Allan Poe decided to do it here and publish it in this publication. And it was kind of a... it's kind of amusing to think that he got away with this sort of dig at the Whig Party, but obviously whoever was editor at the time thought it was funny. So that's kind of an amusing element. And there's also this funny concept where Allamistakeo reveals that, oh yeah, Egypt had an equivalent to America that popped up during his lifetime. And it was also 13 colonies who popped up and decided they didn't want to live under the pharaoh. They wanted to live in democracy. And they did. And then he reveals that it pretty much fell apart by running itself into mob rule. Again, kind of an interesting idea of the that implication that, oh yeah, all these things we think are modern, no, they actually happened way in the past. And the fact that the ancient Egyptians have lived through so much of it that they could pretty much tell the cycle of history right then and there. That's kind of a funny idea. And again, some commentary by Edgar Allan Poe, with the strong implication that America is ruled by mob rule, which is an interesting assessment, and it's one that plenty of political commentators have made before. So even if you don't agree with it, you can't say that Poe was alone in that political assertion. Well, the last thing I wrote down as a thing I liked about it is that one of the core concepts of the story is that this mummy, Allamistakeo, was part of a class of ancient Egyptians called Scarabaei, and the Scarabaei were unique among the ancient Egyptians because when they were mummified, they were not mummified with the typical rites of removing the organs, like the brain and the heart. And the reason they were done that way was because the ancient Egyptians wanted a process of maintaining their history. Because apparently in ancient Egypt, according to the story, people on average lived around 800 to 1,000 years. But in order to make sure that ancient Egypt maintained itself and that their history was not distorted by lies, the Scarabaei would be entombed and wake up every couple of hundred years to make sure the Egyptian historical documents are accurate. And so the later Egyptians are not swayed by falsehoods. And of course, Allamistakeo points out every time one of them woke up and looked over the documents, they realized, oh yeah, every single time the history had been perverted. So that's both that's a really funny idea, that an ancient historian waking up and discovering that, oh yeah, history's been perverted. And it happens every single time over these thousands of years. But it's also kind of a cool concept. I like this idea of like, oh yeah, a society that makes sure its history is kept clear and precise and unmolested simply by having a specified class of people being put in suspended animation so they can wake up and correct the future. So that's a kind of a neat concept, and it's in the middle of this goofy satire. So that's a lot of fun, and I really like that idea. So the final ranking. What's the final ranking I give to Some Words with a Mummy? I rank on the 5-star system, 0 out of 5 being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. And I would give this story a solid 4 out of 5 stars, which in my terminology is a good story. It does what it intends to do, and it does it well. I think, like I said, the biggest issues I had with the story are that the one ending punchline doesn't quite work for me. And the story is kind of inconsistent with Allamistakeo's powers of observation. Like sometimes he knows everything about modern day and sometimes he doesn't know, and that inconsistency bugged me. But on the whole, I think the story is very good. I think it's a strong satire about obsessing with the past and how that can come to bite you when it turns out the past is actually way better than your current reality. And also about how the belief that we are always progressing as we move through time, can be a bit faulty. There's actually a line here in the story. Let me see if I can find it, where Allamistakeo kind of comments on progress and mentions that the ancient Egyptians realized once they reached the peak of the civilization, yeah, progress wasn't really necessary. Let's see. Okay, yeah, here's the part that talks about progress. It says the modern men read from a book, and it says, quote, "We read out of," and they read from this book. They say, and quote, "read out of it a chapter or two about something which is not very clear, but which the Bostonians call the great movement of progress. The Count merely said that great movements were awfully common things in his day, and as for progress, it was at one time quite a nuisance, but it never progressed." So the kind of that idea of that, like, yeah, progress, it's a nice concept, but we once we already figured everything out, it was kind of pointless. So kind of an interesting critique of the idea that we're always progressing as a society. This story kind of presents the idea of, well, maybe you're not. Maybe you're regressing as a society. In ancient Egypt is where mankind peaked, and it's all downhill from here. Which is a very cynical perspective, but it's humorously delivered, and I actually kind of enjoyed that element. Yeah. And it's because of that I actually think this is one of Poe's stronger satires. I have not read every single Poe satire, but I've read a number of them. And this is definitely one of the stronger ones. And I suspect this is probably because this was towards the close of his career, when he'd had over a decade of writing, and he'd kind of figured out what made a good satire work. So this is very impressive in regards to his satire writing. And I would definitely recommend this for any Edgar Allan Poe fans who are sort of looking for different kind of stories that are not necessarily his horror tales. And I'd really recommend this to anybody who's just sort of interested in a comedic mummy story. Like, if you want to see a mummy story that is much more humorous and kind of playing with that idea of what would actually happen if an ancient Egyptian woke up in the modern day, this would probably be a lot of fun for you. Any inspiration? For those that don't know, I'm a working writer, and whenever I do these reviews of stories, I like to comment about whether I think the story has inspired me in any way, for like any story ideas. I will say for this one, I like the idea of an ancient past that was way better than the modern day. I think that's kind of funny, the idea that, the past, that, all of our movies and shows show, it's another wasteland, nothing's good in that time and era, but then you go back and reveal, oh no, it's actually perfectly fine. In fact, it's better than modern day. That's kind of a funny idea. I also kind of like the concept of somebody who obsesses over the past, but then they learn to dislike it the more they get a taste of it. That's a concept I've seen before. I remember it in an old Twilight Zone episode. It was that Twilight Zone episode with Buster Keaton. At one point, a guy from the modern 1960s goes back to the 1890s and finds he hates it. Because he actually has to live with the consequences of what was happening in the 1890s and all the limitations of that era. But yeah, so two very contrasting ideas. One where the past is great, and the second where the past is not so great. So there's definitely some stories to be dredged with those ideas. So maybe I'll think about that for a bit. So yeah, that's the all I have to say about Some Words with a Mummy. I am going to be leaving 2 links in the description. Both of them are versions of Some Words of the Mummy. It's freely available. You can read it for free. One is from poestories.com. And this one is pretty cool because it has a bunch of the definitions of some older terms that modern readers may not know much about. So if you're kind of scared of reading this because of antiquated language that uses terms you may not understand, poststories.com has a very good version if you want to check that out and get those definitions to those old words. The second one was it was a Poe society of some kind. I've forgotten its name. I forgot to write it down, but it's a Poe society that has the story, but before it has sort of this prelude written by an academic. I believe his name was Abbott, something like that. And he sort of talks about the background of the story, sort of the cultural context of what was going on when the story was made. That's where I got a lot of the information about the cultural background for this tale. So I highly recommend reading that. That's very illuminating about this piece. But yeah, other than that, that's all I have to say about Some Words with a Mummy. This was a fun first story for Mummy May. I'm looking forward to the other ones. I'm also looking forward to digging more into Edgar Allan Poe in the future. So thank you all for everyone who listened. I hope to see you again soon. Bye.